Good morning. This is Darrell Gunter. I'm your host for Leadership on WSOU 89.5 FM and streaming on the net at WSOU.net. Well, ladies and gentlemen, today we're in for a real treat because we have the author, Mr. Eugene Pete Wolfe, who is going to share with us his discussions, his book about Boris Johnson and other world leaders. Pete, welcome to the program. How are you doing today?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Excellent, excellent. If you could, before we jump into your book about Boris Johnson, which is a very timely topic, could you share with our audience a little bit about your education background experience?
Yep, thank you. So I was a Soviet studies and major at Cornell, and I went to work for the government for a few years after that. And while I was doing that, I got a master's at George Washington. And then I had a friend who lived in Japan for a while and said, any fool can teach English over there. So it seemed like a good idea to go try something different, live in a different country, learn about another culture. So I persuaded my darling wife to quit our jobs. We took some Japanese lessons at the U.S. Department of Agriculture graduate school. So we weren't totally unprepared. Sorry. But so we just picked up and moved to Tokyo in 1991. And at that time, Tokyo was the most expensive city in the world. And we found out subsequently that 50 people a day were arriving in Narita Airport in Tokyo to try to teach English because the English-speaking world was in a recession. So it didn't quite go as planned. But I figured as a Cornell graduate, maybe I could get some help there. And I had heard that some politicians needed foreign secretaries to correspond with senators or whatever. So I said, okay, that sounds like a pretty cool thing to do. And I called the Cornell Alumni Association. The head of the Cornell Alumni Association was the president of the Imperial Hotel in Japan, which is the most prestigious hotel. And so I figured this guy's got to know some people. I get back a short message. Mr. Inamaru does not know any politicians. Literally, like the next week in the newspaper, there's a picture of Mr. Inamaru with the Thai cabinet. I mean, he knew politicians, but for whatever reason, he wasn't going to help me. So I tried another avenue, which was the George Washington University Alumni Association, which didn't actually exist, but they put me in touch. The English language operator put me in touch with a guy. And it's sort of like as luck would have it, this guy worked for a member of the Japanese parliament who had gone to George Washington University, who was the president of Temple University, Japan.
Oh, wow.
And so, but Temple University was coming up with all kinds of reasons why they couldn't start an MBA program in Tokyo. This guy figured that would be a moneymaker. So he cut his ties with Temple. He went to the US. He found a college that was in debt and he bought it for $1. And it had a campus in Huron, South Dakota, London, and he was going to try Tokyo. So one of these things is not quite like the other. And so his idea was to start a university in at least a Tokyo branch and then build up to an MBA program. So he needed people who could teach with a master's degree. And I said, okay, I'd love to teach, but I'd also like to learn about Japanese politics. Can I be an intern, go to your office, do some things? Japanese politics at the time was really interesting. And he said, sure. So we did that for 2 years. Excellent experience. I then went to graduate school at the University of Chicago, studied reform in the Soviet Union, Japan, and also South Africa. And then I got a job at DePaul University. Then I taught at University of Illinois. Then I was at Northwestern. Then my wife got a job in England. And I figured my kids were young. It'd be a good time to try to find out, to try to write a book. So that's what I did.
Wow, what a fascinating and very deep background. That is awesome. I'm curious, do you get calls today from the US State Department in regards to what's going on around the world because of your insight and your experience?
You know, they have people who know a lot more than me. I mean, yeah, no, I mean, I was in Japan for a while. I know Soviet stuff, or Russian Soviet stuff a bit, but I'm not an expert in one country. My whole interest has been comparing countries, and and I haven't been doing. I've been writing books for the last 10 years or so. So yeah.
Well, your previous book was called Dangerous Seats. What is that? What was that book all about, and what prompted you to write that book?
Okay. Well, when I was studying Japanese politics, I came across a sort of like a fact that changed my life. If you can. In the 1920s, there were so many fights in the Japanese parliament that the party started putting their biggest guys on the aisles, and the nameplates they had on their desk, they had to secure them because they were using them as weapons. So here was a case in which violence is so common that it's basically changing the institution.
Wow.
I had never heard anything like that before.
Yes.
And I thought, is that common? That can't be. I mean, so when I had a chance to go to England, my question was, does that happen here? And if so, is it a thing that's happened recently? Is it an old thing? So what I began to do is look at all the dangers that parliamentarians had faced over the course of English-British history. And what I found was what I ended up calling it was the drama of British political development in 815 violent acts. I found a huge number of incidents, and at first Parliament was really weak. The Kings called it when they wanted basically to raise money. There wasn't much conflict there. The first conflict I found, though, was one politician punching another, drawing blood in 1316.
Okay.
So old, a long time ago.
Right.
And things started to change in the 16th century when Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church because he wanted to get a divorce. This required changing a lot of rules, a lot of religious rules, a lot of political decisions had to be made. He needed the House of Commons to help him, which meant they had much more power now. They started to have more influence. And after he died, Elizabeth, the first Elizabeth, started the parliamentarians were getting more and more assertive, and she didn't like that. She kept telling him, "No, you're supposed to do what I tell you to do." They started saying, "Well, that's not. We're an institution. We do our thing." She started putting him in jail. There were at least one politician died in the Tower of London because she wouldn't let him out.
Wow.
So this was sort of another danger of the seat, right? These people were not doing anything you would say is unusual for a parliamentarian. They were meeting, they were calling for the monarch to do things like name an heir. They were right. So, but this was the development of Parliament as an institution. In the 17th century, the conflict between Parliament and the monarch grows. There was a famous case in 1629 where the king had told the Speaker of the House to stop debate because he didn't like the way it was going. The Speaker tried to get up and end the session. 4 MPs grabbed him, stuck him in the chair, and then they did the business they wanted to do.
Wow.
The king said, enough of this. Those politicians ended up in the Tower. He didn't call Parliament for 11 years. And so it looked like, right, the king had won, but he needed money eventually, so he had to call Parliament. When he did call Parliament, Parliament was very feisty. Again, he tried to bully Parliament. He actually went to Parliament to arrest 5 MPs that he didn't like, personally at the head of some soldiers. They ran away. And then that started, basically, that was the beginning of the Civil War, in which Parliament eventually defeated the monarch, executed the king, abolished the monarchy, and set up a religious government for about 10 years.
Wow.
Actually 20 years.
I wasn't aware of that history.
Yeah.
So Parliament took over the government, and did you say they executed the king?
They executed the king, and they got rid of the monarchy. They got rid of the aristocracy, and they created, this was the sort of power was religious. there were the Puritans,
Mhm.
who wanted to purify the church. They thought the kings were too Catholic, and they wanted stronger. They actually one of the incidents happened on Christmas because Parliament was meeting because they didn't like people celebrating Christmas because you're supposed to be serious on Christmas. Anyway,
Wow.
so this guy Oliver Cromwell comes in, becomes the Lord Protector, rules over the country for about a decade, and then when he dies, people start saying, "Well, that wasn't actually that great." Um, and so eventually they bring back the monarch, but but Parliament has clearly won, right? So the monarch is back, um, and especially in 1688, they get rid of a Catholic monarch
Okay.
and bring in a Dutch uh, leader who becomes king. Um, but Parliament says, well, there'll be some conditions if you want to be the king. So now Parliament's really got the upper hand. So after that, there was really very little threat to members of Parliament from monarchs because they had the upper hand now. But what was starting to happen was in Italy, they used to have vendettas where one person would do something, then I'd have to do something back to not only them but their family, and they would have, right? So that you get these huge bloodbaths. And what Italy eventually did at the end of the Renaissance was decide, okay, well, let's try to make this a little more civilized. A little, instead of having total warfare, you have limited warfare. So they created this institution called the Code of Honor, or the duel.
Oh,
And so then if you were insulted by somebody, instead of you doing something to them doing something back, and you go back, ad infinitum, the duel was supposed to be, you insult me, we fight, it's over.
and the duel was with a pistol or with a sword?
At the beginning, it was just swords, right? And so this came to England in roughly the late 16th century, and in the 17th century it became a huge problem, and it grew, especially after the return of the monarchy, because it was a very aristocratic institution, and so for 250 years the British Parliament spent a huge amount of time, over 100 instances, where they just stopped their business to try to resolve quarrels between their members so they wouldn't kill each other.
Whatever happened to the good old-fashioned fist fight
Um,
versus, a fight, you get beat up,
right.
you're still
But
alive.
it did not necessarily go away. But with the code of honor, if you were a gentleman, you had to respond a certain way. So if somebody hit you, you couldn't just say, I'm going to hit you back. You said, well, I demand satisfaction as a gentleman is to which a gentleman is entitled. So it encouraged conflict, because if you said something to me and I pretended not to hear, or I said, well, I'm interpreting that in the best possible way, other people would say, you're afraid to fight him.
Wow.
And if you're afraid to fight him, then you're not really a gentleman, and we can't associate with you. And if you can't associate with me and I'm a member of Parliament, I'm not a very effective member of Parliament. So it became a huge deal. And as I said, for 250 years, there were hundreds of incidents where politicians tried to fight each other, and Parliament stepped in.
Wow.
But
I really love the title Dangerous Seats, because you think you have a seat in Parliament. That, it's a
well, they talk about safe seats, right? Safe seats are ones where you don't have any competition, really, so you can win elections easily, right? So, and we have, in U.S. Congress, we have lots of safe seats, right? And that's the
yeah,
alternative, right? So, but in Britain in the 19th century, there was pressure for democratic reform. As I said, dueling is not very democratic,
right,
because it's aristocratic, it's gentlemen, right? And so as the political system changed, it became a liability to be a duelist if you were a politician.
right, right.
So what you see in the 19th century is the danger shifts from somebody's going to shoot you or stab you with a pistol or with a sword, to party versus party violence. and they had some brawls. They had a lot of sort of scuffling. In the beginning of the 20th century, for the first and only time, they brought the police in to restore order in the House of Commons. The police. I mean, a year after that, they changed the rules to say that basically the Speaker of the House could just dissolve Parliament and just end the session if there was quote unquote grave disorder. And that means he didn't have to call the police. He could just say, "We're done here.
We're done. Yeah.
We're done." Okay, so but over time, as things became more democratic, you had less and less. There was still, politicians still fought a bit, but the danger increasingly was from outsiders.
Wow.
So you started having, and they're trying to influence politicians because it now matters and they're now involved. And you started having terrorist attacks. You started having assassinations. You also started having sort of performance violence, like people taking a custard pie and shoving it in a minister's face just to get attention. Anyway, and so this is actually the biggest thing now. And if you may recall that in 2016, an MP was killed over Brexit, and I think it was last year, maybe the year before, another MP was killed. So again, it's become a real issue, but the kind of violence that has threatened politicians in Britain has changed, over the centuries.
Wow. So let's now move over to your book, Boris Johnson and 100 Facts. And why do you feel that he was the most unlikely person to be a prime minister?
Well, on the one hand, he had sort of the golden resume. He went to Eton, one of the oldest, most prestigious schools in Britain. He went to Oxford. He was president of the Oxford Union, which is a launching pad for lots of political careers. But he did so many things. He had more lives than a cat in terms of politically speaking. He did all these things that would have killed a lesser political career. So right after he finished at Oxford, he got a job at the Times newspaper, probably the most venerable newspaper in Britain, right? A big deal. And about a year later, he was fired for making up a quote. And he didn't just make up a quote, he made up a quote that he attributed to his godfather, who was a historian. And he didn't just make up a quote that he attributed to his godfather, he got the history wrong, which as a historian is kind of a big deal, to make somebody look really bad, right? Anyways, he got fired for that. But Boris being Boris, right, that wasn't the end. He got another job at another important newspaper, the Daily Telegraph. Did that for a while, was very successful. He got a job at The Spectator, an important conservative magazine. And again, doing a good job. He really connected with, they call it Middle England, sort of middle class, he had a really good rapport with them, and they liked him. So eventually the editor of the publisher of The Spectator wants him to be the editor. You're a really talented guy. You seem like you really have a good idea where things are going. But what I've heard that you're trying to get to Parliament. I don't want you don't have the time to do this job and also be in Parliament. So I will give you, if you take this job, you have to promise me not to run for Parliament. Okay, Boris says, yeah, okay. 6 months later, you know what he did? He was in Parliament. And to make it even better, to get into Parliament, he told his constituents in Henley, being the editor of The Spectator is probably not really compatible with being your representative. I can't do both. So if you elect me, I'll step down as the editor of The Spectator to devote myself to being your representative. He's elected, and guess what he did not do?
It's-
Right. So okay, so Boris has a right. So people might have been pissed. Didn't happen. Boris gets eventually becomes in the cabinet. The Conservative Party's out of power. They give him. He seems like he's a talented guy. They give him a position. Um, he doesn't really take it very seriously. But a little while later, there are stories circulating that he's having an affair with a member of one of his staff at the Spectator. He's gotten her pregnant twice. She's gutting her second abortion. This didn't really look good for the Conservative Party. So the Conservative Party leader, Ian Duncan Smith, says, Boris, I've heard these rumors. What's going on? No, that's not true. Well, a few days later, became quite clear that it was true. Boris was out of a job. You might have thought that would have ended his political career. Most people, right, lying to the head of the party is not a good thing. Not Boris. So eventually, it's at around this time, he's sort of lucky in that there's an election. The Conservatives don't do well. The leader that he lied to is gone. And the new leader happens to be this guy named David Cameron, who went to Eton with Boris, went to Oxford with Boris, was in the Bullingdon Club with Boris, which is sort of like this fraternity on steroids. And so he says, okay, I'm gonna help you out, Boris. Boris gets another position. He has another affair. David Cameron doesn't really care because, what Boris does, Boris. And so the next thing that happens is, let me think here, the chronology. David Cameron, though, sees Boris is pretty popular. And David Cameron is not the most charismatic guy. So Boris is kind of a threat. So Boris is thinking, I'll go become prime minister. David Cameron is saying, no, that I think I want that job. So at the same time, there is there's going to be a London mayor election, and the Conservatives have never won the London mayorship. They really won it, and they sort of pressure Boris to take it, partly because that gets him out of David Cameron's hair. And eventually Boris takes it. He does okay. He becomes mayor. He wins a second term, and everybody says, okay, Boris, he seems like he's gotten better now. Then he decides to run again for parliament, comes in there, and eventually becomes foreign secretary, so like Secretary of State. And he's heard, when the prime minister has a policy, he's heard calling it polishing a turd, which is not what you usually say about your leader, and he's out of a job. Again, it looks like this guy's career is toast. But not too long after that, he's prime minister.
Wow.
And he's done all these things. I mean, he's had the number of children. He only recently has acknowledged how many children he has. He's got 4 with his second wife. He's got 2 with another wife. And then there are either 1 or 2 with other women who were not his wife. But anyway, so he has this, yes.
Wow. Very, I mean, what is it about Boris that the women like?
It's, if you look at him, that is a good question, right? There was another politician, John Wilkes, who was really ugly, and he famously said, "Give me 30 minutes, and I'll make her forget about my face." And Boris is, I mean, he's a lot of fun. He's really charismatic. They call him.
I was in the UK recently, last month, and I was talking with an industry colleague there, and she was complaining about Boris Johnson and how he creates these situations of importance when he has an affair that he wants to gloss over. So
right. No, it's all about Boris. It is all about Boris, and yeah. No, sorry.
Yeah, no. What was the most interesting fact in your book that you found? There's 100, but I'm sure. But what would be the top two or three about Boris? I mean, we're learning a lot through our discussion today.
So Boris is an act. He You look at him, the first thing you notice is his hair, and it looks like a haystack. It looks like um, he's never seen a comb. His clothes, at least until fairly recently, were wrinkled. He seems like he has no idea what's going on, um, but it's all an act. He he has cultivated this persona of, the British call it Bertie Wooster from Wodehouse, but this sort of bumbling idiot, and he's great at it. Um, People laugh at him, but he's in on the joke. And so the hair, before he goes on TV, he messes it up. He makes it look like he just got out of bed, and you can't take him seriously. But people, and that's the sort of secret of success. Nobody takes him seriously. So he does these things that a serious politician would find, their career over. But hey, that's just Boris. He's such a, card. And so, yeah, he gets away with it.
And was he the primary reason to convince folks that we need to the UK needed to leave the European Union and to implement Brexit?
I mean, he's a big part of it. First of all, when he got his job as the at the Daily Telegraph, his whole he was sent to Brussels, and most people treated Brussels very seriously. Boris decided to make up stuff. He tried to make fun of the bureaucrats in Britain, in Brussels, saying they were trying to have regulations to have like one size coffins, that they were going to regulate condom size, they were going to check on the curvature of bananas, all these crazy things that made it people think these guys are out of control. Right? So he built up this anti-Brussels feeling, and then when David Cameron called a referendum on Brexit, Boris, after sort of equivocating for a little while, says, "I'll go with voting to leave." He was the most prominent supporter of leave. He had all these lies about leaving. He said, "You're going to we'll save a lot of money that we can use to spend on the health service." He even said, if we vote to leave, we don't have to leave because Europe wants us to stay so badly that if we just show we're willing to leave, they'll make all these concessions and we won't have to leave. Well, he said, if we stay a member of the EU, Turkey will join the EU. All these Turks will come into Britain. All these lies, and they were not true. But the referendum passed with 52%. It's really hard to believe, if Boris had not been doing all those things, that it would have happened.
Pete, you are a wealth of information and knowledge about Boris. I'm curious, has Hollywood come to you to say, hey, we want to take your book and make it into a movie series?
No, I don't think so. But I mean, I'm not the first person to talk about Boris. And I would not be surprised if somebody is thinking about it, because he is larger than life. But it's probably not going to be me.
Well, as you know, believe it or not, we're getting close to the end here. But I did want to talk about, at the University of Chicago, you focused on leadership, trust, and political reform. Specifically, you looked at how Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, FDW clerk in South Africa, and Ozawa Ichiro in Japan brought about political change in countries where one party had been in power for a long time and previous reform efforts have failed. How did they do that? What were the key recipe for them to convince folks to follow them?
So all of them were really good at cultivating a sense of trust among members of their party, right? And what I look at in my dissertation looked at previous reformers who didn't have that trust. Um, and what Gorbachev, de Klerk, and Ozawa did was they were able to convince key members of the party that, hey, I got reform. I'm not going to do anything that really will endanger you. And I claim that there are two different kinds of trust. Um, there's a sort of a passive trust, which is basically saying, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. And that was someone like Gorbachev, where there are a lot of people who were suspicious, but they thought, here's a guy who came up through the ranks. He had always shown he was dedicated to the party. He's not going to do anything too bad. We'll give him the benefit of the doubt. When he said we'll have to have elections, party leaders would in the regions would have to run for elections. He knows what he's doing. It's not going to get out of control, but it did. De Klerk, on the other hand, had what I would call active trust, in that a lot of people thought what this guy is doing is really crazy. It's going to hurt us badly, right? White whites in South Africa were less than 20% of the population. How can you have a more democratic settlement where the whites basically think they're going to stay in charge? But here's a guy, right, who had been able to do things that people thought were politically impossible before. And so what I'm calling active trust is when people say, hey, this guy seems to actually have figured it out. He seems really smart, and I trust his judgment more than I trust my own judgment.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Well, Pete, we're going to have you back on the program because I have a whole list of questions that we haven't even dived into. But ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank our guest, Mr. Eugene Pete Wolfe, who is the author of Boris Johnson and 100 Facts. And if you want to look at his other book, Dangerous Seats, I suggest you do that. Pete, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, that wraps it up this week on Leadership with Darrell W. Gunter on WSOU 89.5 FM. Remember, have a great weekend, but remember, leadership begins with you.